Welcome to Losi Fanta Audio Adventures. This series is about true stories that really happened. Stories in which men twist themselves into knots, women mercilessly play out their quirks, and no one can seriously claim to have acted out of pure reason. Told with biting wit, humor, and delightful sarcasm. Enjoy listening to the things people do out of love, lust, or desire, and bitterly regret. Experiences caught between heart and body.
A relationship with many breaks, many culprits, and a kidnapped coffee machine. I had a getting to know you phase with this woman. No relationship, no us, no official anything. More like that cautious circling where both people claim they're completely relaxed, while internally a committee is already in session, seriously discussing whether this is a spectacularly unnecessary life project. It was winter. Christmas season. A party. She had been there for a long time already, at least an hour before I even left. Back then, there was no line, no obstacles. She just went straight in, as if she were emotionally more punctual than I was. When I arrived later, I was standing outside, in the cold. That kind of cold that isn't romantic, but immediately asks how much you hate yourself today. By then, a line had formed. Tired people, irritated faces, that aggressively polite atmosphere where everyone pretends to be socially functional while internally being willing to sell their mother for a warm room. I stood there, wondering whether I really wanted to do this. Whether I seriously wanted to freeze my feet off just to squeeze into an overcrowded space and pretend this was some kind of gift to my life. Spoiler, it wasn't. So I texted her that I was thinking about going home. Calm, rational, no drama. And that she was, of course, welcome to come with me. No ultimatum, no pressure, just a reasonable option in a completely unreasonable emotional environment. She stayed inside, and I immediately noticed her mood shift. Not because I didn't want to see her, but because I had dared not to sacrifice my physical well-being on the altar of romantic self-denial. Apparently, I had committed a cardinal sin. I was unwilling to suffer voluntarily in order to prove interest. When I finally went inside anyway, I knew within the first second that I had already lost. Not factually, emotionally. The room felt like a courtroom moments before the verdict. She was there, and she was angry. Not hurt, not sad, angry. That cold, targeted kind of anger that has already decided someone is about to be punished as an example. And then I saw her with another man making out. Not casually, not accidentally, not in any way that could later be explained away as a misunderstanding. It was demonstrative, physical, direct, right in front of me. And in that moment, I understood this wasn't a spontaneous reaction, but an educational concept. Learning through humiliation. Very efficient. Very sustainable. Very toxic. It hit me harder than I expected. Not because we were something serious, but because I was just starting to do something dangerous. Trust. That rare, stupid act of opening up where you think, maybe this time you don't have to keep everything behind bulletproof glass. And right there, I learned how quickly closeness becomes a weapon when someone decides to control you. I walked away. Within the party, another corner, other people. I didn't want to see it. I wanted to pull myself together. I wanted to tell myself I was reacting like a mature adult. Unfortunately, she had other plans. She followed me. With him. Over and over again. No matter where I went, they'd soon appear nearby. Kissing. Displaying. Like a traveling exhibition titled, "This is what happens when you don't function." This was no coincidence anymore. This was intentional. She wanted me to see it. She wanted me to feel it. And she wanted me to understand why this was happening. Because of me. because I hesitated, because I thought about going home, because of the cold, because of one single sentence that was apparently interpreted as an emotional declaration of war. I went home that night with a feeling that wasn't loud. It was quiet, heavy, and very awake. Something in me understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding, but an imprint. A sentence burned itself into me, uninvited and permanent. When tension arises, she looks for validation elsewhere, and you will be held responsible for it. And yet, somehow, love was already in play. Of course it was. Love, famously, is a state in which you excuse things you'll later have to unpack in therapy. I told her I loved her. I meant it. I forgave her. We became a couple, and we built that relationship on a foundation that had already been publicly demolished once. But I believe forgiveness was maturity, strength, something you're supposed to be capable of if you don't want to be an asshole. Nobody mentioned that you can also completely erase yourself in the process. The years that followed were intense. Closeness that felt good as long as I didn't move, as long as I was present, available, adapted, and preferably quiet. Expectations that seemed harmless individually, but collectively remodeled my entire life. I was supposed to become part of her world, her dog, her horse, her routine. Ideally integrated without residue, like a piece of furniture with an emotional support function. I just wanted to remain myself, which in hindsight turned out to be an astonishingly ambitious project. Every hesitation, every need for space was interpreted as a personal attack. The more she pushed, the quieter I became. The quieter I became, the more threatened she felt. A beautiful cycle in which both of us lost and nobody even came close to winning. At times, I was under so much pressure that I needed distance. Not for drama, not for games, but simply to breathe again, to think, to exist. I couldn't endure this permanent state of blame, expectations, and emotional bombardment without slowly dissolving myself. For her, that distance was a threat. So she did what she always did when closeness didn't work the way she wanted it to. She sought validation outside. Other men, situations, affairs. Of course, never cheating. We were on a break. Or emotionally not fully together. Or energetically separated. Some definition was always conveniently available when needed. And I stood there, gasping for air, eventually wondering if I might actually be a terrible person just because I occasionally felt the need to breathe. No matter what happened, it was my fault. Of course I made mistakes. I wasn't an innocent lamb, more like an emotionally used car with prior damage and no warranty. But somehow, I was still always at fault. If she was angry, I had made her angry. If she kissed someone else, I had basically invited her to do it. If she crossed boundaries, it was a perfectly understandable reaction to my mere existence. I genuinely began to believe I had a superpower, making people commit bad decisions just by breathing quietly. I probably could have monetized that. Just so it's clear what kind of emotional performance pressure I was under, here's a completely harmless, everyday example that turned out to be surprisingly educational. We were at a birthday party in summer. Picture-perfect summer. Warm, golden light, a beautiful garden with a pond, the kind of place where Instagram automatically applies filters, even without Wi-Fi. We spent the whole day there, talking, laughing, objectively having a really nice time. Her best friend was there. Her best male friend, too. Other friends as well. Everything harmonious. No drama, no tension, no warning signs. We spent the whole day together, and in the evening, I sat next to her the entire time, continuously. Physical contact at a consistently high level. Cuddling, holding hands, closeness as a standard feature. I talked with her best friend. Her best male friend was present, attentive, engaged. I barely interacted with the other guests, not out of rudeness, but because the evening was already going very well, and that was perfectly fine, at least by my standards. A few meters away, there was a bonfire. Other friends were sitting there, and there was this freshly in love couple. Very fresh. Very in love. Very visibly in love. Bonfire, glowing embers, intense eye contact. Probably a mental slow-motion soundtrack playing. We weren't sitting there. We were at the table, drinking something, talking, relaxed. In other words, doing exactly what grown adults usually do when they're having a pleasant evening. When it got late, we went home. And that's when it happened. The relationship performance review. Why we hadn't sat at the bonfire. Why we didn't look as in love as the others. We were supposedly much more in love, a much more perfect couple. Why we hadn't shown it. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't about whether the day had been good. It was about whether it had been staged correctly. I had made the classic mistake of living closeness without properly illustrating it. I had shown affection, but without props. No bonfire, no symbolic location, no visual victory over the other couple, no external impact. And that was the pressure. Always. It was never just good. It was good, but misplaced. Nice, but insufficiently presented. Love, but in the wrong setting. And yes, that was just one example. But it explains very reliably why I eventually grew tired of feeling like I had to deliver a relationship, even on warm summer evenings in a garden, instead of simply living one. After years, we separated. Officially. Emotionally, of course not. There was this invisible channel between us that activated whenever tension arose somewhere. And then she took my coffee machine. The one from my mother. Christmas present. Symbol of a semi-functional adult life. She explained calmly, almost kindly, that I didn't really need it anyway. And as a student, such a machine was expensive. Taking it from me was simply cheaper. No fight, no tears, no scene. Just a clean cost-benefit analysis. Very efficient, very revealing. She immediately had a new future ex-boyfriend. Some people just keep planning ahead. And sometimes, I imagine that coffee machine standing somewhere, making coffee every morning while listening to her future ex being told why he was at fault. Softly humming, steaming, thinking, same lecture, different man. And I thought, the poor machine. It had no choice. It had to go. I later bought myself a new one. And every time it runs, even now, I think about how love doesn't mean enduring everything. How closeness without responsibility is nothing but control with a cuddly interface. And how people who constantly blame you aren't necessarily cruel, just exceptionally talented at removing themselves from every equation. And of course, she came back after a year. Of course. This time, I was the distraction, for regulation, for emotional interim storage. And eventually, she showed up more and more often, as a transition, as an emotional parking lot with a very long stay. Eventually, it became official again, and I hoped again, briefly. Not naive, just tired. Maybe this time it would be enough. Maybe we'd learned enough. No, we hadn't. The dynamic remained. Her expectations grew. My need for space remained. And from that contradiction came pressure again. Blame again. The same game restarted with the same rules. But that's another story. This one ends without a bang, without drama, without liberation. Just with the quiet, bitter realization that some lessons are incredibly expensive. And that coffee still helps, not with healing, but with staying awake.
Thanks for listening. Honestly, respect for sticking it out all the way to the end. I hope you had fun, or at least felt a tiny bit called out. Maybe you even thought, "Thank goodness that wasn't me." Don't worry, the next story is definitely coming. And next time, too, it'll be about the things people do out of love, lust, or desire, and later regret. Until next time on Losi Fanta Audio Adventures.